So the question is really, what might Africa do to enhance its position in the global economy? Recognizing that the answer to this question could take more than all day to explain, and probably a fleet of consultants along with it, I've tried to keep my answers down to the bare essentials. There are only three ways in the world in which to create new wealth. And by this I don't mean more money for the wealthy or the successful. I mean wealth in the Adam Smith sense of the word, that is, expanding societal wealth, which, through its contribution to growth, trickles down through the economy by the invisible hand that Adam Smith spoke of, country by country, region by region, and it brings the potential of a better life for everyone in its path. I want you to listen very carefully to this piece. These three ways are manufacturing, mining and minerals extraction, and agriculture. Africa as a whole has a vast and immediate potential in at least two of these areas already, notably agriculture and mining and minerals extraction. The manufacturing part of this trident, economic trident if you like, if encouraged and developed, can also ultimately become a great source of economic growth for Africa as well. And you know, if you're unsure about whether this works or not, if you take a look at the successfully growing economies of today, Brazil, China, Indonesia, many others, they're growing because of their preeminence in these three wealth-creating areas, not for other reasons. If you look at the successful nations of yesteryear also, it was the same story. So if Africa wants to rise to the proper place in the future history of mankind, it will need to become good at all these wealth-creating activities. As the just retired CEO of a highly successful and iconic major corporation, it is interesting to ask me why the large corporations I previously worked for do not already have a huge presence in Africa. It is in fact a relatively simple answer, which boils down to the following factors, many of which you will understand. The first is the corruption and bureaucracy which exists in many parts of Africa, underdeveloped end markets. 3, spotty education with its attendant impact on the skills base in those nations, personal and asset security, underdeveloped transportation, especially in the interior. But before we become overly sensitive or overly judgmental about these issues, history also teaches us that all developing countries, no matter where they are, have these same kinds of problems. An emerging high-quality democracy usually is the only factor that drives it out. If you read the lives about the founding fathers of America and their successors, all the times following the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, corruption, speculation, migration, diaspora, poor education, poor health were all part of the problem. They were all very, very common. They were the norms, not the exceptions. But it is a problem which must be solved, otherwise it will unquestionably delay the time before which Africa can reach its full potential on the global stage. And I believe it will reach its full potential on the global stage. The progress of Africa towards a better future will naturally be a multi-speed race. Some countries, based on their resources, both tangible and intellectual, and on local government policy, will be able to move faster. Others will move slower. Those who create an environment which is good for business, and I mean this in the most positive and ethical way, will be the winners of this race. The others will be the losers, and so will their people. So this is much down to the individual governments to decide what they can afford financially today and are willing to do to solve the problems which are listed above. The best way for a country to create value is to focus on the creation of economic growth. The difference in value creation and job creation, when there are even relatively small differences in growth rates, are phenomenal. For example, if we consider my homeland of Britain, if that nation were to move the GDP growth rate from just 2% to 2.5%, not much of an increment, over a period of 10 years, that difference would create 400,000 new jobs. It's a staggering figure. In Uganda's case, the GDP growth rate over the last 3 years has averaged 6.2%. If it were moved to only 8%, GDP would expand from $16 billion to almost $35 billion at the official exchange rate. So depending on what happens to population growth, prosperity could almost double in the next 10 years for the average Ugandan citizen. These growth rates are very much within the capability of the Ugandan economy, especially with the recent discoveries of oil and the excellent potential in agriculture. For perspective, just to see if this makes sense, these growth rates are less than China has seen every year in the last 10 years, and yet it is the second largest economy in the world. The best way in which a national government can stimulate this kind of growth is to construct a business-friendly economy and encourage commerce and education. It must also develop new export partners as a channel for distribution. You know, the world only contains two kinds of countries, the producers and the consumers. And without consumers, there is no need for producers to produce. And this is in fact the basis of the current malaise, economic malaise that we see in the world. Now we may look at the challenge as overwhelming, but it isn't. One of the very best examples that Africa could look to would be that of Singapore. When it left Malaysia in 1965, it essentially had nothing at all. It was a small island state, very small, with no natural resources, not even a water supply, no easy means of defense, and ethnic Chinese people there discriminated against by the then Bumiputra policy of Malaysia for the Malays. It was that discrimination against an ethnic minority which prevented Malaysia from reaching its full potential, and which saw the birthplace of one of the finest and best managed democracies in the world. Today, Singapore, and that's really only 35 years or so on, has a GDP of around $250 billion and a GDP per capita of $45,000 per person, almost 4 times that of Malaysia. So who says you can't do it? The approach to solving these problems would be the following. 1. Make the improvement of literacy and education of all the citizens in Uganda the highest possible priority. If a country is ever to become world-class at the wealth-creating activities of agriculture, minerals extraction, and manufacturing, which I mentioned, it must become good at engineering and science. Initially, this might be achieved by the sponsorship of higher education at world-class foreign universities, but ultimately the development of world-class universities within Uganda and perhaps in Africa more generally. Number 2, it should work steadily to build an ecosystem around core competencies which the country already has. The most obvious of these in Uganda today is agriculture, which today comprises about 22% of the economy. Manufacturing is about 25%. But oil will come later and help. It should create a low corporation tax structure. You know, many companies say it's not what you keep, not what you make that counts, it's what you keep that matters. Companies are not taxpayers, they're actually tax collectors. It should encourage inward investment of major international players in the development of the 3 wealth-creating approaches I mentioned earlier. It must secure those investments by assuring the safety of personnel and the rule of law, and a requirement to use local labour at a gradually increasing level. 5. It should encourage the continued education in English language as the dominant language of commerce around the world. Mandarin may have to be inserted later. In the short run, the government should encourage the immigration of highly skilled people from around the world. This could be by the re-immigration of highly educated Ugandan nationals currently living overseas, the diaspora, or those of other ethnicities and national origins. It should resist the temptation to discriminate against any ethnic group within the country, whether Ugandan born or not. This is a very delicate topic, but it must get to grips with the issues of bribery and corruption at all levels of society. It might, however, follow the example of Colombia in this regard. It's not that many years that Colombia had terrible problems, yet today it's completely solved. So it can be done with the right leadership in place and a great deal of courage.